All right, so let's look at our fiscal policy, because we've been looking at this idea of fiscal policy. And remember that we had these different types of fiscal policies, right, where we had expansionary, and we had contractionary. And in our expansionary fiscal policy, we saw that taxes were going down or government spending was increasing. And the result of this was such that if we had a deficit, it was growing larger, or if you had a surplus, it was getting smaller, right? With our contractionary fiscal policy, it was the exact opposite. Here we had taxes increasing or government spending decreasing, such that if you had a deficit, it was getting smaller, or if you had a surplus, it was growing larger, right? And we have, in essence, three different views of fiscal policy and how well it works or how well it doesn't work. So let's kind of look at them in the ADAS model, right? We have this Keynesian view. We have our kind of classical view. And we have our, what would be called, supply side view. And there's more views than that, obviously, but we're just going to look at these three because they're the three main ones. So let's kind of go all the way back to our problem where we've got, say, real GDP. We've got our price level. We've got aggregate demand. We've got our long-run aggregate supply. We've got our short-run aggregate supply, all right? So we're at some full employment level of output YF, and here we are initially, we're in some recession, right? We're at output level, say, Y1, and some price level, just call it PL1. And we know from the ADAS model that eventually what's going to happen here. Not aggregate demand, it's what's changing. The short-run aggregate supply, right? Eventually, this recession, we've got a lot of unemployed people. Remember here, you see unemployment is greater than the natural rate of unemployment, right? So in essence, you have cyclical unemployment. We don't want that, right? There was something that happened that made aggregate demand decrease that got us to this SRAS1, or maybe it was a change in short-run aggregate supply. Eventually, we know that whatever it is, eventually our short-run aggregate supply curve is going to increase here. He's going to eventually do this, is what we're saying, all right? And eventually, we'll return to this full employment level of output, and we'll do so at this lower price level, say PL0, or I'll just call it PL2. So we know that eventually, SRAS increases to SRAS2, output equals YF, price level equals PL2. Okay. Keynes says, though, hey, this could take a long time. And he's famous for saying in the long run we're all dead. Meaning, yeah, eventually everything is going to work out, but why wait for that? Why not go ahead and fix it now? Why wait for the long run to occur? So he says, well, if you're in this type of situation, what we can use is we can use an expansionary fiscal policy where we'll go out and we'll borrow money and we'll make aggregate demand increase, right? We'll in essence do this. So rather than waiting a long time to go from point B to point C, he says, let's just change aggregate demand to go to point A. Because there's no difference between point A and point C anyway, other than the fact that the price level is higher. It takes more green pieces of paper to buy stuff at A than it does at C. But there's the same amount of output. Similarly, if we're in a situation like this, so here we would use expansionary fiscal policy. We could also be in a situation like this where we've got, say, real GDP. We've got the price level. We have our long-run aggregate supply curve. We've got our aggregate demand. We've got our short-run aggregate supply. I mean, here we are now. I'm going to call this output level, say Y2, just to distinguish it between the other guy. Here we are at this guy. We're in a boom, basically. All right. Here we see output equal to Y2. We've got unemployment less than the natural rate of unemployment. And what eventually is going to happen here? If we do nothing. What happens here eventually? Exactly. The short run decreases, right? Because we see here at Y2, employment is greater than the natural rate of employment. The unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate of unemployment, right? This is where people are working essentially kind of like overtime almost. Workers have to compete with, employers have to compete with themselves to get workers. How do they do that? Raise wages, right? Nominal wages are increasing. And we know that eventually this short-run aggregate supply curve is going to decrease to this guy. And so we'll have some price level 4, because here we are at, say, price level 5 or whatever. Right. We know that we're going to return to this full employment level of output at, say, YF. We'll just happen to do so at this higher price level. And Keynes says, why do that? Why not do this? Have some contractionary fiscal policy, something that makes aggregate demand decrease. And so what we get is we get aggregate demand doing something like this. And so here we'll go to, say, I'll call this guy E, I'll call this guy F, I'll call this guy G. So here we are initially at E, and he says, look, rather than going to F, and waiting for nominal prices to increase, why not just engage in some contractionary fiscal policy? We'll just cut government spending and we'll increase taxes such that aggregate demand decreases, and we'll go to G. Because what's the difference between F and G? Nothing, other than the price level, right? And remember, Keynes says, don't let me touch my tie anymore. Keynes says we can change aggregate demand in such a way that we can make that guy be exactly where we want him to be. We don't have to guess. We can know exactly, right? With that marginal propensity to consume and that marginal propensity to import, and knowing all of that lets us know the multiplier. And we know how large autonomous expenditures are and all that stuff. We can essentially it's just an Excel spreadsheet. You just plug in the number that you want for these changes in taxes or these changes in government spending. Now, you've got a political problem here, which is that once you actually start spending money, it becomes difficult to take money away. Right? Once you start giving people something, taking that money away now becomes very, very difficult. So politically speaking, it's easy to do this. It's difficult to do this. But from an economic standpoint, there's another problem, and that's called the crowding out problem. And the crowding out problem says, well, when you go out and you borrow all of this money, you're going to change the demand for loanable funds. So you have this market, right? If you're going to have the government go out and borrow money, which is what they're going to do on this expansionary fiscal policy, they're going to borrow the money. They're going to have to go out into the market and they're going to have to borrow it. So you can say here is like, well, when the government wants to borrow money, they're going to go to this loanable funds market, all right? Now, how many of you guys have some savings bonds from grandma or Aunt Susie or mom or whatever, right? I mean, that's the loanable funds market, right? There's a market out there for people borrowing and lending money. And that can be for U.S. savings bonds. That can be in your savings account when you guys put money into your savings account. Your parents put money aside for college. That was the loanable funds market. They're putting money in there for savings. They're saving it. They're the suppliers. You guys are borrowing money to go to school, and you're now demanders. You're the ones taking money out, right? There's some bank somewhere or some government somewhere that's giving the money to the university, and they got that money from somebody else. So we have this market in the loanable funds, so that here's our demand, and I'm going to call this our private demand. And here's the supply of loanable funds, right? And we have some quantity here. I'll just call this Q1. And there's some interest rate, say I1, right? But when they borrow money, they got to go into the loanable funds market. So when the government says, give us money for this savings bond, and you can give the savings bond to your kid, right? That $25 or $50 or $100 or whatever that they gave to the government back in 1997 when you guys were born is money that could have gone to something else, right? It could have been used and somebody else could have borrowed the money. So you have this change in the demand for loanable funds, right? So here would be demand of both private and public. And we get something up here. We get this interest rate up here, Q2. And we get this interest rate here, say I2. All right? So we get this higher interest rate. But it's more than that, right? Because when the interest rate goes to I2, what happens to private borrowing? What is it at now? Do what? Q2 is the total. That's private and public. How much is private borrowing? Yeah, it's less than Q1. It's way over here. I'll call this guy Q0. Right. Here's your public. Here's your private. So you see that private investment, private borrowing, goes down, right? It didn't even stay at Q1, it went down. Interest rates went from I1 to I2. So let's think about what this guy says. Because here's the total borrowing that was occurring. We used to have total private borrowing of this. Now we have let's see, we've got public borrowing here, we've got private borrowing here. In essence, what this increase in the interest rate does is it makes consumption go down and it makes investment go down. And there's two different implications, a short run and a long run. Remember, the Keynesian model looks like this. Here's your 45-degree line, here's your aggregate expenditure line. All right, here was our output. Here was our aggregate expenditures. And we wanted to get over here, we wanted to get to YF. Right? And we said, oh, look, we can just easily program the number into our Excel spreadsheet and know exactly how much to increase government spending. We know exactly how much to borrow. All right? We're just going to change it by this much. So here's this increase in G, but if that increase in G changes interest rates and causes these guys to go down, the guy doesn't become this guy. What does he do? He doesn't shift to this guy. He's down, right? Because G's gone up, but consumption and investment have also come down a little bit. In other words, we're actually here. Right? Not at YF, we're at actually, say, some amount Y2. Remember, GDP, I want to close all these markers so I don't accidentally drop them on myself. We got GDP here, C plus I plus G plus XM, right? This guy's going up, right? This is what the aggregate expenditures were. Oh, look, we'll just increase G and we'll get aggregate expenditures to go up, and therefore we'll get output to increase. But these guys are also going down. So when we're over here and we say, oh, okay, go out and borrow $500 billion or spend an extra $400 billion or whatever the number is. The G causes aggregate demand to go up, but the change in interest rates causes consumption and investment to come back down. So we don't see it going out here to 82. We actually see him coming here to say 83, right? He doesn't quite get us there all the way. That's the short run implication. The short run implication is that you can't just plug in the number from here and get to where you want to be. If this guy's going down, what does that mean for the long run?
Go down.
Do what?
It's also going to go down.
Well, if investment's decreasing, what else is decreasing? Investment goes down. We don't build the factory. Interest rates are too high. I'm not building a factory in 2017. So what does that mean for 2025? The factory doesn't exist, right? The quantity and quality of resources and the level of technology are what determines this guy, right? So here's our guy in 2017. And had we built the factory out here in 2025, the guy's going to be out here, right? Because we've got the factory out there making stuff and everything else and all that other rigmarole. But the factory doesn't exist. He never comes into existence. So he's not out here at 2025. He's actually becomes this guy right here, right? There's what your PPC is in 2025, the guy in red, not the guy in blue. Because this decrease in investment made you say, I'm not going to, the increase in the interest rate made investment go down. If investment's going down, the quantity and quality of our resources are smaller. The capital stock is smaller. The future output will be smaller. You will have less stuff in the future. And here's what's really interesting. How are people going to know that here they are on the red line and they could have been at the blue line? You see what I'm saying? People will be like, they won't even know that it's there. Here's what we could have been doing, right? This kind of goes back to this whole 2% thing that the economy's been growing at. Versus this 3 to 4%, right? I mean, if we continue to have this, when we could have had this, here we are in 2025, we're on the red line, but we could have been on the blue line. But people won't even know it. They won't even know, like, hey, we could have had X number of stuff. We could have had this much more crap, right, in real terms. So people argue, okay, A, you got this crowding out effect. You're not even going to get all the change in output that you want to anyway. And even if you could, all that you're doing is sacrificing future output for today. You're just making people invest less today. You're making the economy worse in the future. The new classical view, or the classical view, kind of says that people are rational. So here's our long-run aggregate supply curve. Here's our aggregate demand. Here's our short-run aggregate supply. Here we are at Y1, here we are at YF. And basically this guy says, look, we know eventually what's going to happen. We know eventually the short-run aggregate supply curve will increase and we'll get to this full employment level of output. If you guys engage in this type of policy over here, if you go out and you engage in some policy where you're in essence borrowing money, people know that that means that you're going to have a deficit. And the deficit today means that at some point in time in the future, you're going to have to increase taxes. So you can kind of think of it like this. You can think of it as the budget deficit over two different time periods. So here you are in all of these years, year one, let's not do that. Year one, year two, year three, year four, etc. Year five. Here's our revenues, here's the taxes. Here's our expenditures. Here's our deficit slash surplus. All right, so let's just make up simple numbers here. It's 100, it's 100, it's 0, right? So here in year one, we've got revenues of 100, we've got expenditures of 100. The government is spending everything that's coming in. They're not spending more, they're not spending less. They have no deficit, no surplus, right? And then here they have some recession. They say, oh, let's go out and let's borrow money. So they have revenues here, and let's just say that these guys fall to 90 and these guys increase to, say, I don't know, 110, it could be anything. Now you have this deficit here of 20, right? And then next year, things get fixed. So here they are, maybe even revenues go back up to 100. And they also say, basically, once you start spending that money, it's hard for people to stop spending the money. They want their money, right? But we could even make this guy go back down to 100. You still have this deficit, but you still have this guy you got to pay, right? So that here in year four, when these bonds come due, the expenditures here are now 120. You got to pay that back. Well, the only way to do that is to increase taxes here. If you don't, you still have the deficit. All you need to do is just move the bonds down, right? And so that maybe now you're back down here to 100, and now you're back down here to 100, right? So you are, in essence, and these expenditures are in essence paying this back. I guess I can make it like this so that it looks like that. So you have this, quote, surplus 20, 0, 0, right? In essence, what they're saying is that, look, you got this deficit right here, but you're eventually going to have to increase my taxes to pay it back. The bonds do eventually come due. You can't continue to borrow money forever. And in fact, thanks to interest, it won't be 20 that you have to borrow or raise taxes for. It'll actually be like, say, 30. All right? So it's not a matter of, oh, look, we're going to go out and we're going to borrow 20 and we're going to pay back 20. You're going to borrow 20, you'll end up paying back 30. Households know there's only one way for them to get this additional money when the bonds come due, and that's to raise taxes. So even if they engage in some policy here in year two where they cut our taxes and they increase expenditures, eventually they're going to have to do the exact opposite. They're going to have to raise taxes and cut expenditures. So even though the aggregate demand curve could, in theory, do this, if people know that this is going to occur, they're going to save back for the higher taxes so that the aggregate demand curve shifts like this and then essentially comes right back because people are essentially saving the money for the future taxes. All right? The alternative way to think of it is this, and this is especially true if it's a closed economy, if you're not borrowing the money from outsiders, from foreigners. If we're the government, if we're the economy and I'm the government, and I say, you guys aren't spending enough money, lend me money to spend. If you guys have income of 1,000, right, and I say you're not spending enough, and I'm spending, so you guys are spending, I don't know, you're spending 1,000. Or you can spend anything. I'm spending 100, all right? That's the way it currently is right now. And then I say to myself, you guys aren't spending enough money. We need to spend more, right? And so I'm going to borrow from you. You guys lend me 200. So now I can spend 300. But you guys now have 200 less. So now you're spending 8. $1,100. Right? G is going up. Hey, I'm going to borrow money and I'm going to spend it. This guy's going up. But where am I going to get the money from to borrow? From you. And so if I've borrowed 300 from you, you have 300 less to spend. And so this guy goes up by 300, this guy goes down by 300. What happens to this guy? He stays the same. And so their idea is that, look, even if you get around the fact that people are going to go ahead and spend the money, they're not going to save, you still have to get the money from somebody. You still have to borrow the money from essentially people today. You didn't change anything. You just changed who was spending it. You didn't change the amount that was there. And so the new classical view says, essentially, fiscal policy doesn't make any sense. It's worthless. It's not going to work in the long run. The third view is the supply side view. The supply side view looks at this and says, look, here's tax revenue. Here's tax rates. If we have a tax rate that's equal to 0, how much tax revenue will we collect? 0, right? If we have a tax rate that's equal to 100%, how much tax revenue will we collect? How many of you guys are going to work later today? Okay, what's your name again?
Paige.
Paige. Okay, what do you do again?
I'm a before and after school daycare worker.
Okay, so you're going to go, you're going to deal with snotty kids, and you're going to lose 100% of your paycheck. They will take all of it.
I quit.
Exactly. How much revenue will they collect? 0. But clearly, tax revenue is not 0, right? There's some tax rate here between 0 and 100 that makes tax revenue as large as it can possibly be. I don't know what that tax revenue number is. I have no idea what that tax rate number is. It could be 20%, it could be 40%, it could be 80%, I don't know. And economists don't really know either. But there is some rate that maximizes tax revenue. There is some rate where if you go beyond this guy, and I'm just making up a number, let's just make it 40%. And I don't know that that's what the number is. I'm just making something up. If you go beyond 40%, tax revenue actually falls, all right? So if you have this tax rate here of, say, 60%, people are like, screw it, it's not worth it. It's not worth dealing with, all right? And so here, the supply side view, this is called the Laffer Curve. The supply side view says it's not what you spend, it's what you tax. And it's not even necessarily the amount that you tax, it's the rate. It's the marginal tax rates that are important, right? It's not what you spend, it's how much you take. Because in essence, if tax rates are 20%, if the government takes 20% of my pay, they are in essence taking all of my labor every Monday, right? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100%. I don't teach on Saturdays, right? And so if they're taking 20%, it's like every single Monday that I come to work, I'm essentially not doing anything. I do all the day's work, I deal with all the emails, I deal with all of the kids, I deal with all of the crap from MSU, I deal with all of the crap from everybody else, and I got nothing for it. It all went to somebody else, right? And so their idea here is that it's this guy that's important. If you raise this guy too much, the marginal tax rate's too much, people are like, forget it, it's not worth it. So if you keep them low enough, people have the incentive to save and invest, right? Because in essence, the taxes are a form of taking. They're taking your labor, they're taking your time and giving it to somebody else. So their idea is that here we are, at this full employment level of output, say YF, and here you are at some price level, say PL1. The only fiscal policy that's important is this guy, these marginal tax rates. It's that guy that's important. And if you keep these guys low enough, and like I said, we don't know what that number is. We have no idea. People have an incentive to save and invest and work. And if they have an incentive to save and invest and work, then the PPC curve becomes this guy, right? So here we are at here in 2025. Here we are in 2017. So their idea is that here we are with, say, low marginal tax rates. And I use the term low in parentheses because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like 12%. It just means that it's lower than this guy right here, whatever this number is. As opposed to here would be our PPC curve in, say, 2025 with the high marginal tax rates, right? In essence, people wouldn't work and save and invest as much because it wouldn't be worth it. And so the PPC curve is that guy. It's the guy in blue rather than the guy in black. And so their idea is that, well, if you do this, you actually see the PPC curve, the long run aggregate supply curve, actually does this. Right? And you get this new price level PL2, and you get some new, say, thing out here. In other words, they're taking more of a long-term view of things rather than a short-term view. The fiscal policy in the short run doesn't really matter. It's the long-run stuff that matters, is their view. And there's some evidence that people respond to these incentives, right? Because if you think about it like this, think about like this. Somebody is on welfare. They're getting a check for, say, $1,000. And you say, that's bad, we don't want you doing that. Go get a job. And so they go and they get a job. And that job pays some amount, whatever that number is, say $10,000. Or it earns $9,999. And we've said, hey, once your income goes over $10,000, you don't get welfare anymore. And so now their boss says, hey, would you like to work more? And they say, sure. And they go out and they earn $10,001. But what happened to their real income? It went down, right? Because here it was they had $9,999 in wages. They had $1,000 in, say, food stamps. It could be anything. Right? So here they have actually $10,999. They go out and they earn $2 more to go above $10,000. This guy falls to zero. they're actually facing marginal tax rates that are above 100%. You see what I'm saying? They take not only the dollar that you are earning in welfare, not only do you lose that, but you also now, of course, have to pay taxes on the dollars that you earned. You have a marginal tax rate. You're facing a marginal tax rate that's higher than 100%. And people do this all the time. I mean, we know people respond to these guys. It's not just the marginal tax rate that you pay that Congress is talking about now. It's also this kind of stuff too. Because in essence, what people will do is they will say, I'm not going to work $10,000. I will only work $9,999. It doesn't make sense. For them to go from $9,999 to not being on welfare, the income can't be $10,000. It's got to go way above that guy, right? $15,000, $20,000, whatever the number is. So we know people respond to these. Because we can see it. We can see it with not really, really rich people. We can see it with really, really poor people. They're making rational decisions. Why go out and work and get an extra $2 in wages and lose $999? That doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to goof off. I'm not going to go work. I'm not taking the extra hours. I don't want it. Because they're facing a marginal tax rate that's really, really high. So, which view is it? Keynesian, new classical, supply? I don't know. If you figure it out, you let me know. I'll write the paper and win the Nobel Prize, and I can go to Sweden and get the nice little $1.2 million and the nice little bitty gold medallion that I can wear around my neck for the rest of life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right? This is the end of test 3 material. I will